Members of the Blue Ribbon Panel, the charge before you is both clear and consequential. Connecticut is not facing a temporary funding challenge. What you are examining is a structural misalignment, one that has developed over time, between the cost of educating students and the way the ECS formula distributes funding across districts. Across the state, costs continue to rise. Staffing, special education, multilingual learner services, transportation, and inflation are increasing year after year. But the ECS formula, as it currently operates, has not kept pace with those realities. The result is that districts are being asked to absorb a growing gap, one that is not driven by inefficiency, but by structure. At its core, this is an issue of equity. The current system does not consistently align resources with student need. It relies heavily on property wealth, while underrepresenting income and the effects of concentrated poverty. And it does not fully capture the cost of educating students in communities where need is not just present, but deeply concentrated. To understand that clearly, we can look at Bridgeport, not as an exception, but as a representative example of what is happening across Connecticut. Bridgeport serves approximately 19,000 students. Nearly 89% of those students are identified as low income, and a significant portion are multilingual learners. This represents one of the highest concentrations of student need in the state. At the same time, the district faces approximately $15 million in annual cost growth. These are not optional expenses. They are driven by required services, special education mandates, language supports, staffing, and rising operational costs. In addition, the district will lose approximately $15 million in one-time funding that had previously helped stabilize the system. Taken together, these conditions produce a structural gap of roughly $25 to $30 million annually. And that number requires precise interpretation. $30 million is not a request for expansion. It is not a proposal to increase programming or add services. It is the minimum required to avoid cuts. It is the floor. At that level of funding, a district like Bridgeport can maintain its current staffing levels, it can preserve existing programs, it can prevent increases in class size, but it cannot restore programs that have already been lost. It cannot meaningfully reduce class sizes, and it cannot expand supports for students. It simply prevents further erosion. Members of the panel, that distinction is critical. Because much of the conversation around education funding treats increases as investment, when in many cases they are simply preventing decline. And this dynamic is not isolated. Urban districts such as Hartford, New Haven, Waterbury, and New Britain are facing similar pressures: high levels of concentrated poverty, increasing multilingual needs, and rising service demands. At the same time, rural and regional districts, including Windham, New London, Norwich, Torrington, and Killingly, are facing their own version of structural stress: declining enrollment, limited local capacity, and fixed costs that cannot be reduced proportionally. Different conditions, but the same outcome. Costs are rising faster than funding, and the system is no longer aligned with reality. This is not a new finding for the state of Connecticut. More than a decade ago, a state task force identified these same issues. The conclusions were clear. The foundation level was too low, the formula overweighted property wealth, student need was underrepresented, and costs, particularly in special education, were rising faster than the system accounted for. The work was started, it was not completed. And that is why the responsibility now rests with this panel. The path forward does not require a complete redesign of the system. It requires a targeted realignment, using tools that are already understood. There are three primary adjustments. First, the foundation must be increased. A reasonable adjustment would be approximately $2,500 per student, bringing the effective foundation into a range of roughly $14,000 to $14,500. This reflects the actual cost of education today. Second, the formula must better reflect true ability to pay. Shifting the wealth calculation from a 70% reliance on property and 30% on income to a 60-40 balance would reduce distortions and provide a more accurate measure of capacity. Third, the formula must recognize the impact of concentrated poverty. A district where 80 or 90% of students are low-income faces fundamentally different conditions than one where that percentage is much lower. Adding an additional poverty weight of approximately 0.10 to 0.15 for those districts begins to reflect that reality. Together, these adjustments generate approximately $28 to $30 million in gross funding for a district like Bridgeport. But even that figure requires clarity. Due to structural features within the formula, approximately $8 million is absorbed before it reaches classrooms. The net impact is closer to $20 to $25 million in actual operating funding. And even at that level, we are still talking about stabilization, not expansion. Which brings us to the most important distinction before this panel. There is stabilization funding, and there is opportunity funding. Stabilization funding prevents cuts, it maintains current services, it keeps districts from moving backward. For Bridgeport, that is approximately $25 to $30 million. Opportunity funding is different. It restores programs, reduces class sizes, expands supports, and improves outcomes. That requires investment beyond the floor. Members of the panel, the decisions before you determine whether Connecticut's education funding system reflects the reality of today or continues to rely on assumptions of the past. This is not a question of excess. It is a question of alignment. Alignment between cost and funding. Alignment between need and resources. Alignment between what we expect from our schools and what we provide them. Because without stabilization, districts will continue to cut. And without moving beyond stabilization, they cannot improve. Your work is to set that floor, to ensure that districts have the resources required to maintain what they currently provide. But the long-term goal must go further. Because stability is not the outcome this system is meant to deliver. Stability is the floor. Opportunity must be the goal.